pleasure to introduce today's webinar presented by Chris Wilcox. Thank you for joining us. So Chris will be presenting monitoring coastal fisheries using underwater sound, a low-cost alternative for estimating fishing effort, gear types and compliance rates. As I mentioned, please do pop questions in the Q&A, and after Chris's presentation he'll be able to answer them. So without further ado, I'm going to close down my sound and video, and if you're happy, Chris, I'll pass over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for making time to come and listen today. I'm super interested to chat to people in the network about what we're doing and you know, the potential for applications and in particular for collaboration. Just by way of background, I'm a research scientist. I did my PhD in California and worked in fisheries and fisheries management for about 20 years here in Australia at the National Science Agency. Starting in around 2010, I led a group that worked on surveillance technology and analytics for addressing fisheries monitoring and surveillance, kind of in a general context and also around marine protected areas. I left CSIRO a couple of years ago, ran the marine program for the Minderoo Foundation, working in roughly the same space. And I'm now getting ready to move on to an NGO in the US, based out of the US, called WildAid, that works on enforcement around marine protected areas globally. So I think they're in 16 countries and 15 countries and about 100 MPAs at the moment. So that's sort of my biography. I'm a statistician and marine biologist working in fisheries, so interested in sort of technology and quantitative things. I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing around hydrophones, so using underwater sound. So you should be looking at an introductory slide with a couple of small boats on the coastline in Malaysia. So I got interested in underwater sound as a possible way to monitor vessels, really thinking about what you see in this picture. So these vessels are all small. If you try to pick them up on radar, you might or might not see them. In general, the satellite data that's available, at least in the civilian world, will struggle to pick them up or be very, very expensive. People use coastal observation towers to look for these sort of boats, but that then has a high labor cost. And so I was really wrestling with how we do monitoring and surveillance for these sort of boats, because in the end, they're the majority of vessels around. As I said, I'm getting ready to join WildAid as the director of their marine program. So I will be starting there in March, and as of March, you can reach out to me there, but beforehand, you can reach out to me directly by email, and I'll give my contact details at the end. Okay, so just a little bit about fishing and context. This is some work from a recent review of fishing vessels globally, and what you can see, we spent a lot of time talking about industrial vessels, which is the pink slice or kind of reddish pink slice. But small scale vessels and industrial vessels do a lot of fishing globally, but they're actually a small minority of the operators. And one thing you can see in this slide is that the smaller artisanal vessels that are motorized, that fleet is expanding. Engines are becoming cheaper. You know, lots of things are changing, and that means actually, particularly in the coastal zone, most of the fishing activity is from small vessels. So just looking at the footprint of these vessels, this is some work from Yannick Rousseau that was published in 2024, looking at fishing effort globally. And there's his data that he put together goes up to 2017. So this is the most recent available. And what I want to point out to you is, if you look at the amount of fishing effort and where it's distributed, although we spend a lot of time talking about what's going on offshore, most of the fishing effort is relatively close to the coast. Certainly on the continental shelves, and really much closer in general than that. And that's true whether you're looking at the Gulf Coast of the US, Southeast Asia, the coast of Africa, or Australia. Really, you see the same pattern everywhere. Most of the effort is concentrated fairly close to shore. Similarly, the impacts to marine systems are mostly coastal. So this is from some work by Ben Halpern looking at the global footprint of human impact on the ocean. And what you see really is that the nearshore habitats, things like coral reefs and seagrasses and mangroves, are most heavily impacted. And that's true whether you think about fishing or more broadly about other impacts. So our fishing effort is mostly by small vessels, mostly in the coastal zone. And in general, the impacts are in the same, mostly in the coastal zone. The inshore environment, so, let's say the first 50 kilometers offshore, and maybe even the first 10, really presents the most complex environment for protection also. So I just want to talk a little bit about the underlying drivers of why it's hard to manage things in this space. So these are 3 slides out of our recent study that was published in 2012, looking at marine protected areas. And if you look at the slide on the left, you have the Human Development Index against the number of MPAs in a country. And what you see is that as countries get wealthier, they tend to have more marine protected areas. And unpacking that a little bit, if you look at the middle slide, the percent of the exclusive economic zone that's covered by MPAs against that population in fisheries, what you see is a negative relationship. So more people fishing, less of the EEZ is covered by MPAs. And similar to that, if you look at the coverage of MPAs against the daily food supply in the country from fisheries, it also is a negative relationship. So more or less what you can draw from this is where dependence on harvesting from the marine environment is important, and marine protected areas are less common. And it's not an unreasonable thing, right? If people depend on these resources for both their livelihoods and their food, basically closing off access is going to be harder. And I think what this means is that if we're pursuing goals like 30 by 30, so 30% of the world's oceans in protected areas by 2030, it means we're going to have more cooperative approaches with the communities that are living in these areas and utilizing these resources than people have typically thought of. So kind of circling around, what does all this mean at a 20,000 foot level? The coastal environments are under a lot more pressure than offshore. There's a significant shortfall in protection in the coastal zone. Marine protected areas are expanding in less developed countries, but much slower than in the more developed countries. And really enabling community-led and operated management is the path forward to addressing this shortfall. So ultimately, it's going to be working with the communities to balance protection and usage. And that means we're going to need to understand pressure, fishing pressure, and confront compliance in a community-led way, which I think is emerging but fairly different from the way it's been done in the past. So I think there's really 2 key questions thinking about this sort of management from an MCS perspective. The first is, pardon me, how much fishing pressure do coastal regions experience? So it's important to understand both authorized use and unregulated use. That'd be fishing effort by local community members, say if they have a locally managed marine area, and fishing by outsiders. So a lot of these community management systems will identify community members and non-community members and give them differential fishing access. It's critical for understanding the performance for a number of reasons. Nearby fishers can deplete mobile species. Just to build a picture of how the fishery system is operating, you need to understand the amount of pressure on it in terms of fishing effort. And the second key thing that needs to be addressed is the extent of non-compliance in a given managed area. So non-compliance obviously is hard to measure because the activity isn't allowed, so it's generally going to be clandestine. And in particular, it's hard to achieve persistent and broad scope surveillance. So you can put a patrol boat on the water and have effective surveillance, but it's only there for a limited amount of time. And the same is true of almost any of the other approaches that we have, whether that's coastal radars or satellite data. It's hard to get persistent and broad scope, particularly with these small vessels. The traditional approach for industrial vessels has been vessel monitoring systems. So these are basically a GPS transponder on the boat, generally transmits to a satellite or maybe to coastal receivers, and then goes via some comm system to a central surveillance center. I've worked on a lot of this sort of data from big national VMS systems to little local fishery monitoring approaches. The little device in that person's hand in the photo is called a spot trace. And on the right are some plots from a study we did looking at activities of small scale vessels in Indonesia using those spot traces. But there's a bunch of challenges with putting this sort of technology on small vessels. First of all, the vessels don't have power. Second of all, there's an affordability challenge in that both the hardware and the ongoing service for the system generally has costs. And then often regulators, and I'd say this is almost, the rule, regulators often don't have the power, and there's to some extent some sort of political reticence to impose these sort of VMS style systems on small vessels. So it kind of leads to the question, can we shift to monitoring locations instead of vessels? So can we think about watching places where things are going to happen instead of watching vessels, irrespective of where they go? So at least in the coastal zone, there's probably 5 main options in terms of how you would monitor locations for fishing, whether that's for just general monitoring or whether it is for surveillance, thinking about compliance. And there's some key things to think about. So what's the range of your monitoring system? What's its scope? So how much of the time does it cover? How persistent is it? So over the course of a year, how many days of observation are you going to have, for instance? Can it discriminate activity? So can you tell fishing from diving from other things, or maybe even distinguish gear types? Can you identify the operator? So can we say who the actual individual is? And then a couple of things about kind of requirements. What does its infrastructure requirement look like? And kind of how cheaply can you do it? What's the minimum cost? So the options really are something along the lines of an observation tower. So working from left to right in the photos across the bottom. A shore-based camera, which you'll have to excuse me, is actually the third photo instead of the second. A coastal radar, which is the second picture. The hydrophones that we're talking about today, which is the fourth picture. And then things like drones. And in general, you're talking about stuff that's relatively short-ranged. So the hydrophones, at least for boat engines, have ranges similar or better than most of the other technologies. In terms of scope, only shore radar really has as much coverage. In terms of persistence, you have a few of the technologies that can be persistent. Ability to discriminate activity. This is where there's some disadvantages, say for radar, because you only see presence of things. you can make some inference from how the vessel is moving around, but nevertheless, it's limited. At the other extreme is something like an observation tower where you actually have a person looking through a pair of binoculars trying to figure out what's going on. Hydrophones fall somewhere in the middle. Anything that makes noise in a boat, you can hear. So you can hear an air compressor, you can hear an anchor, any of those sorts of things. Can you identify the operator? This is probably the place where hydrophones are most limited compared to the other technologies. So if you put a lot of effort in, you can fingerprint individual boat engines. And there's obviously lots of military applications for that sort of thing. But on average, with thousands of small launches getting around with 25 horsepower Yamaha engines, for instance, they're not going to sound that different, and it'll be a lot of work to distinguish them. In terms of infrastructure, this is probably one of the places where hydrophones have one of the biggest advantages in that they require very little infrastructure. So basically a concrete block sitting on the bottom at the minimum. And they're very cheap. The one that is in the photo there is about $80. So it's very difficult, even for something like a really simple shore-based camera. They're generally more expensive. Okay, so that's a bit of a scan the horizon. So let's dig a little bit into these hydrophones. So working from left to right in the pictures, the sort of key components of this kind of system are the acoustic recorder itself. So this is the thing that records sound underwater. There's one called a hydromoth that we use. Comes in a pressure housing that's good for 30 meters. Only costs $80. Runs on 2 AA batteries and has a 64 gig memory card in it. So it's compact. It's about the size of your half the size of your fist, and it works very well. If we need communications, over on the right is a picture of a larger casing with battery power, still using the same acoustic recorder, but it's then connected to an external processor that has communications on it. So you could use satellite or mobile phone connections. Then you're talking about more on the order of $1,000 per unit in terms of cost. Then there's the question of buoyancy control. So do you need to have this thing on the bottom, and how do you bring it up and put it down? It's about $300 for that float that you see with a spool of rope, and it has a thing called an acoustic release. So you send a message down to this float, and it lets go of its mooring and comes up on that rope. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But essentially, if you're in a place where you have to have them on the bottom instead of tethered to a buoy on the surface, that's the option. And then if you want to identify operators, you can essentially do that, at least for operators that are willing to participate. You can use something like an acoustic tag. So that photo is acoustic tags that are used for animals. They have a range of about 0.5 kilometer. They make basically a beep underwater. It's individually recognizable, and they last, say, 3 to 5 years. And they make a ping every minute or half a minute. So with one of those epoxied to the underside of a boat, you can actually identify the individual boat. You can do something similar to that that's lower tech by giving boats essentially a code that they make a sound with on the vessel. So for instance, if you put a piece of pipe over the side of your boat into the water and hit it with something metal, these hydrophones can hear that from several kilometers away, which means that you could give community members a particular code, like 2 bangs, a gap, and 3 bangs. And so when they arrive at the fishing ground, if they make that sound, you know that boat is a local boat. So that's a very low cost alternative, but same idea. Okay, so I just touch on this sort of context for deployment. Apologies, this slide doesn't look like it's rendering quite perfectly. But more or less, one of the key things to think about is, how are you putting the gear out? And then, do you need it to be clandestine or not? So if you don't need it to be clandestine and you're out with a vessel, you can just put a buoy on the surface with a rope down to your weight, concrete block or whatever that's keeping it from moving around, and attach the hydrophone to that, and you're done. It's very cheap and easy. In many cases, you do need it to be clandestine, either because you don't want anyone to know that you're making observations in a place, or because the equipment could get stolen or vandalized. And so in that case, then it depends upon whether you're putting it down with a diver or a vessel. So there's a picture on the left of a diver going down with a concrete block that's been dropped from above and affixing a hydrophone to it, and you would recover it the same way. So that's relatively cheap and easy, particularly if the field organization has divers already doing other things. If you can't do that system, then you can use one of the acoustic releases like that yellow float I showed you in the last slide. And on the right is some imagery of us using those. So you see a concrete block in the upper left of that slide. You see a concrete block cast in a bucket. It's attached to a piece of PVC that has the rope in it, and the acoustic release and hydrophone then gets strapped onto that, and some floats. And that whole thing, as you can see in the picture on the upper right, gets tossed off the side of a boat from the surface. And if you look at the picture just below the boat, that's the burn wire that burns and releases the attachment to the mooring. And that's part of that PVC pipe that's in the picture. So then that thing comes up, you have the equipment and the float at the surface, a long rope down to a concrete block, and you can either haul it all up and take it away, or you can haul it up, repurpose it and put it back down. So anyway, that's a bit of logistics about how you actually do it in practice and what you have to think about. Okay, so I'll talk about an application we've been working on in Chile. So Chile has a system of territorial user rights for local fishing communities. They're targeting abalone, which is very high value. And basically that map in the center of the images shows you the locations of all the communities that have turfs along the Chilean coast. And the picture with the gray blobs in it sort of gives you a sense of the structure. So you have a no-take area inside that's cross-hatched inside a larger turf. The community is allowed to fish in the turf and they manage it. Nobody's allowed to fish in the no-take area. And then around the outside of the turf, people from other communities can fish. And so we had sort of two things we were interested in. One is, could we measure fishing effort, which in this case is done with something called an abalone knife. So it's basically a piece of metal. Abalone have a dome-shaped shell, and they attach themselves to the bottom. And you basically shove this piece of metal under the shell, pry them off. So that's legal fishing, but depending upon who's doing it and where, it could be illegal. And then we have people fishing inside the areas with spear guns, and that's illegal. And so we wanted to understand, can we use underwater sound to quantify these two things? And could we help the local communities adopt these as tools as part of their surveillance program for the turfs? Right now, basically, the turf enforcement and monitoring depends upon fishermen out on their own vessels on official patrol. And this is work done with Rodrigo Oyenidel, who's in the photo on the right, when we were out with one of the fishermen deploying some gear. The picture on the left is what one of these turfs looks like. So it's a sort of coastal reserve, relatively near shore. And so we're trying to understand, can we figure out vessel activity? Can we distinguish authorized vessels? And can we distinguish prohibited gears? We put out some hydrophones to do a trial on this, and we made sounds. So we put two hydrophones out 150 meters apart. We made spear gun and abalone knife sounds at 1. So we know what the reference level is at distance 0. And then we wanted to understand what it's like 150 meters away. And what we're trying to do is understand if we can capture these fishing activity sounds and what our range is going to be. So we had about a 50% attenuation measured in decibels at 150 meters for the abalone knife. And the plots at the right show you what's called a spectrogram. So that's frequency on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and the arrow is pointing at the sound of an abalone knife that's picked up by one of these acoustic recorders. The top slide is at distance 0, so right next to it, and the bottom slide is 150 meters away. And more or less, you can distinguish the sounds at 150 meters away. Decibels are on a log scale, so it's actually quite a lot quieter, but we can still hear it. And so if we match them up, we can find the same sound at the further distance. We did the same for spear guns. So 2 hydrophones, 150 meters apart, firing a spear gun 10 times. Again, we get about a 50% reduction in sound power measured on the decibel scale at 150 meters distance. So if you take this data and use what's called the inverse square law, which is an easy way to figure out sound power loss with distance. So sound underwater travels much better than in the air, but it still attenuates with distance. We can calculate basically how far away we can hear something. And the curves are showing you the distance in meters on the x-axis and the signal strength on the y. And so we think even for say a spear gun or an abalone knife, about 1 kilometer away is going to be our detection range. At that point, we're down to about 10 decibels. And so that gives you a fairly long distance. The turfs that we're interested in are a couple of kilometers across at most. I'll just show you a little bit about boat engines. So on the bottom is a spectrogram. The bright orange or yellow line in the spectrogram is actually the resonant frequency, the dominant frequency for a boat engine. So it's about 600 hertz. And you can see on the right the plot of frequency on the x-axis against power. And the red line with the arrow is showing you where that dominant power is. So it's at about 600 hertz. This is for a boat similar to the one that is in the picture above. So a small lancha, as they're called in Chile, with a 40 to a 70 horsepower motor. You can tell a bunch about the boat. You can tell the engine type, so inboard versus outboard. You can tell the number of propeller blades. You can tell its speed and whether it's turning. And you can also locate it in 3 dimensions if you have more than one hydrophone. Okay. We use an automated system for processing the data, very similar to the image analysis that you see in the upper right, where it's basically picking out people out of a photo. So it's the same sort of model. It's called a convolutional neural network. And we basically use the spectrograms. So these pictures with the heat map, the yellow in it. And we treat that as if it's an image. And so it comes in as an audio wave. We convert it to a spectrogram. We run it through our CNN. The CNN then maps out what it thinks are the features in the image, and we have a classifier. And so it can then distinguish sounds, a dog barking or a car, or in our case, a spear gun. One of the key steps is building a labeled sound library for training. And so at the moment, we have trained models for bombs, a trained model for boats, and we're working towards building them for air compressors and a bunch of other applications. Once you have the classification, you can then do localization and tracking to follow things from their sounds. So with 3 hydrophones, you can basically triangulate a boat and you can track it as it moves around. Okay, so at the moment, the interface we're using for end users can be really anything. We can push data to SMART, to Earth Ranger, to QGIS, really any software platform that can deal with essentially space and time data like you would have from tracking systems. We're working on some real-time units that can provide alerts via SMS or email. We had some developed based on a previous hydrophone system, but that was much more expensive. So we're working on redeveloping this. The one comment I'd make in that context is often you get nearly as much information out of essentially an intelligence approach where you put the hydrophones out, you pull them in, you analyze the data to look at patterns, and then you design your patrols based on those patterns, as you would get from a real-time alert. And one of the questions I ask enforcement people when they talk to me about wanting real-time alerts is, do you have a patrol boat and a boat crew that's ready to go and that could respond in real time when you get this alert? So do they have the available time? How long is it going to take them to get to the site where you're doing surveillance? If it's going to take them longer to get there than it will for the people that are there to finish their activity and leave, then the real-time data is not actually giving you anything. So, unless you really actively have patrols on the water that you're going to respond to, you probably get much more use out of the intelligence data. So when, where, and what's happening, and planning in response to that than you do out of the real-time data and trying to queue a response. It's sexy though, so everyone asks every time. So thinking about the applications in terms of human users, we can distinguish a wide range of things. As I mentioned at the beginning, basically anything that makes sound on a boat transmits through the water. So things like anchors, chains, and shackles. So the thing you use for connecting chains to cables and moorings. Winches and pot haulers. So even a small winch like you see in that upper left picture will make noise and we can hear it. Air compressors, probably bottom contact gear, like trawls and seines, we can hear as they disturb features on the bottom, and particularly if they also have mechanical connections like chain and things like that. So for a trawl net. We can hear air compressors, as I said. We can also hear scuba and free diving. Excuse me. We can also hear scuba and free diving. As the bubbles collapse, they make quite a distinctive and fairly loud noise. And so you can hear them surprisingly well. Again, it depends upon how loud the thing is, how far it goes. But in general, things transmit much further underwater than they do in the air. So I'll just talk about two projects that we're in the planning stages for at the moment to give you a sense of kind of how you'd use these things in anger. So one is for the Red Sea, Saudi Arabian waters of the Red Sea. There's about 6,000 square kilometers of reef in 6 major groups running along the Saudi coast of the Red Sea. They have about 8,000 small commercial fishing vessels. There's no tracking systems on these vessels. And so it's potentially going to be the best approach is to sort of use a mix of satellites and hydrophones to monitor them. The vessels are fairly small, about 6 meters long. So they're on the small end for satellite data. So the design is a set of acoustic arrays, about 1 array per 1,200 square kilometers, assuming the arrays are going to have about a 20-kilometer range for detecting boats. That's probably on the conservative side. We can probably hear an outboard more like 40 kilometers away with the machine learning system. It'll take us 15 arrays to get full coverage of the 6 major reef groups. Each array has 3 listening stations, and in order to extend the duration, we use 4 acoustic recorders on a listening station, and we use them sequentially. So we turn the first one on, then when it runs out of memory, we turn the second one on, and so on. We're aiming for 3-month deployments to get a full year of coverage. So we'll do recoveries at the end of every quarter. And this is a no-dive model. So we're using acoustic releases to bring the listening stations up. That brings the cost for a listening station to about $1,670 per listening station. And that's everything: concrete mooring, acoustic release, the lot. The goals are really to map fishing intensity and illegal gears across all of these reefs, and then subsequent to that, to do surveillance inside the closed areas they'll be close to fishing. So a second example is some planning for a campaign on bomb fishing in Indonesia. This is an area with about 150,000 hectares of marine reserve. It's distributed across an area 60 kilometers by 80 kilometers. And there's anecdotal reports of up to 50 blasts per day in some areas. So the map shows you the marine protected areas in the colored polygons, and the stars show you the locations of the listing stations. We'll use 7 arrays of 3 listing stations. We use 3 listing stations because that allows us to triangulate bomb blast locations. The duration in this case is quite short, where our first deployment will be 2 weeks with an aim to characterize blasting in the region. And after that, we'll go to 1-month deployments. And then the deployment and recovery in this case is done by divers during patrols. We don't have any surface presence of equipment, so there's no floats or anything because of both vandalism and theft. And then because of that design, it's only about $180 per listing station, and that's moorings, concrete, all the necessary bits. And here our goal is to do a 2-week deployment to identify the bombing patterns, and then reallocate the network to try to identify source villages. So we'll try to track the vessels subsequent to a bomb. If you think about it, sound data is a bit like video in that we hear a boat approach, we hear the motor turn off, we hear the anchor go down, then we hear a bomb go off, then we hear an air compressor as the divers go over the side, then we hear the anchor eventually, the compressor turn off, the anchor come up, the boat motor on. So if we can identify a sequence like that, we can try to track the vessel back to the village that it's coming from through its sound patterns. Okay, so that's the end of the introduction to what we're doing and kind of acoustic monitoring in general. The whole goal is to sort of empower local monitoring and surveillance, because that's going to be key in successful management of coastal fisheries and MPAs. And I think there's a real move, particularly in the less developed countries, towards community-based management. And so in the end, enabling communities and the regulatory agencies, supporting them to have cheap access to surveillance data is going to be important. Technology can provide significant efficiencies, as we've been talking about here. It can answer the who, what, when, and where with less labor. But the big challenge in this is the technology needs to be simple, cheap, reliable, and informative. And I think that's something that hydrophones can actually deliver, particularly with newer things like the hydromoss I mentioned that are so inexpensive. We're currently in the process of building a global sound library around poaching sounds to train this AI system we've developed. So we'd like to have as many sound samples as we can of the different things that people identify as sounds associated with either fishing or poaching. And we'd be interested to chat with anyone that's interested in partnering. Thanks, everyone. Here's my contact details. Hopefully that's showing up for you. I have a WildAid email that will be active as of the 1st of March. In the meantime, you can get me at my consulting company, Wilco Analytics, or you can reach out to me on WhatsApp on my mobile number. Okay, thanks everybody, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you, Chris. Thanks ever so much for that. That was fantastic. So fabulous. Thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and interesting share with regards to the MPAs and the less common independent high areas of use. And also looking at locations instead of the vessel tracking, which is a real flip and a good way to approach that. Usually what we do now is we move on to our Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, now's the time to pop it in the question mark below, or you can pop your hand up, raise your hand up as well. I will let people have a think and absorb that and pop some questions in. Couple of things I was going to ask. Just you mentioned about the 3-month deployments. What is the lifespan of those, the little acoustic recorders?
Yeah. Okay. Just happened. I have one in my hand. So you basically open the pressure housing. In here, that's the acoustic recorder. Nice. Hold on, I'm gonna turn blur off. Sorry. 2 secs. Okay. Now you can see the blank wall behind me. So it runs on three AA batteries, and then it's got a small memory card slot right there. On basically, if you run it 24 hours a day at 64 kilohertz, which is much higher sample rate than you need, it'll last 3 weeks. The real constraint is the filling up the memory. So they don't work well with more than a 64 gig card. You can duty cycle these things. So you can tell it turn on from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. And basically that cuts the amount of memory that you're using up because you're recording for a shorter time. You can also reduce the frequency. So like I was saying, most boats are down around 600 hertz. So you can sample much, much, much slower than 64 kilohertz. That will also use less memory. So how long you can run it for depends upon what compromises you make in that space. You know, if you were just trying to get a sense of fishing activity in an area, you could run it for an hour a day in the morning and it would last months. But in most of the cases we've been dealing with, we're interested more in surveillance. So we're running them continuously 24 hours a day for a fixed period. The units are so cheap. I mean, this guy's $80 US or 120 with the pressure housing. So really the other option, and this is what we're doing in Saudi Arabia, is you just put 4 of them on the mooring and you turn one on when the other one turns off. And so, you know, at $80, it's more cost effective to just have multiple in the water than go out, recover the thing, swap the batteries and put it back. You're just getting there probably.
I've got another, I know we've got a couple of questions here. I've got another couple of questions as well. So just one of mine quickly was you mentioned that it's been well received, which is fantastic. You mentioned the Red Sea and Indonesia. And if there's more pilots planned, is there a specific place you'd like to hold a pilot? An interesting research.
Yeah, I mean, right now, what we're trying to do is build a sound library of as many poaching sounds as we can, or fishing sounds as we can, from different places around the world. So one of the challenges with sound data is, unless you can automate the processing, you basically have to listen or look at listen to the sound or look at the spectrograms, and that's quite slow and labor intensive. The challenge with automating it using AI systems is the backgrounds are really different in different places because of whatever the biological sounds are, waves on reefs, whatever. So our goal is to essentially build as big a sound library as we can for different poaching sounds. So we'd like outboards on islands in the Pacific, outboards in Southeast Asia and estuaries. In that sense, one of the big goals for us is to find on-ground partners who are running a program in a particular place and interested in surveillance data or monitoring data. We can provide the hardware at cost. Out of that, we get sound samples from the place, and we can provide the surveillance information back. And so, in a sense, that in the hydrophone context, that's the goal, because ultimately we'll have a big sound library and a well-trained model that we will make publicly accessible. So then in the future, if you want to use the equipment in your place, you basically just run a web-based analysis platform and it analyzes it for you, and you don't need us.
Fantastic. I have one more question before I move to the two that we have there. One of our community members, Sergio, he's unable to attend today, so he's not seen the presentation. He's only seen the title. He would like to know something about if this technology would allow us to estimate biomass, since he assumes that for each species it wouldn't be feasible to establish an acoustic footprint, and therefore biomass would not be possible. So I guess going back to reefs and things like this, could it identify fish species and be used in that way?
So there's kind of two things that people are doing at the moment with sound in that sense. One is there's actually, as the equipment's gotten cheaper, people have come to realize that actually many fish make a lot of sound. Mating sounds, alarm calls, all sorts of things. And so people do put hydrophones down, listen for the sounds of fish, and identify fish based on that. If you know roughly how loud the sound is, then you know how far away you can hear it, and you can convert that into an estimate of density. A second thing that people do is they listen to what's called a soundscape. So just the assembly of all the sounds, and you can ostensibly tell a healthy reef from a heavily bleached reef because the fish assemblages and other organisms change as the bleaching happens. Same would be true for overfishing and other things. You can distinguish soundscapes without actually identifying the individual species. So in that sense, people are trying, I mean, we're not trying to do this, but people are trying to draw biological inferences from sound. It's a sampling tool that depends on the animals that you're trying to sample making sound. So, you need to understand the variability in what makes the animals make sound in order to use it to estimate them. I would say another option for his application is you could try estimating fishing effort and use that as a proxy.
Yeah.
Because obviously it depends on the gear people are using, but let's say air compressors, it's easy enough to count the number of boats that arrive, anchors that go down, and then hours of air compressor, and then anchors that come up and boats that depart. And from that, you can get the number of fishing events and the length of the fishing event. And like in the case we were talking about with the abalone knives, we can count individual abalone knife strikes. So, or spear gun fires. So you could potentially count the number of animals, as opposed to trying to count the animals themselves.
Yeah. Fabulous, thank you. I know we've only got 6 minutes, so I'm going to speed through those. That was really interesting. Thank you. And I know Sergio will watch the recording. I'm going to shoot through some of these. So we've had one of our members ask, can you provide a presentation solely on hydrophones from costing to setup of the system?
I've recorded a few videos for people to do that. I'm happy to set up a call, walk someone through it. That's not a problem. Then we can record it, and then they can have access to that. It's fairly straightforward. All the software is free. You need to buy a hydrophone, which, like I said, is $120 with the pressure housing, and have a computer of some sort and a USB cable, and I'm happy to do that. So if they reach out, or we can coordinate through.
Yeah, we'll make sure. I know who the member is, and we'll make sure that happens. Just another quick one. We have Kamal. Thanks, Chris. Fascinating presentation. Have you published any papers on this work?
We haven't as yet. We did a lot of work on bone fishing in Indonesia. Most of it was sort of with operational agencies, so we weren't putting out scientific papers on it. But hopefully we'll get one out on the blast fishing sometime in the relatively near future. But I'm happy to provide information.
Yeah,
PowerPoint is accessible, of course.
That would be great, and we can always share that through the community group, through the resources. So that would be great. We've got 2 more questions. One, Rajdeep asked, do you need special training to use the data? Can fisheries managers be trained? And just a quick second part to that is, how does it help with traceability and certification?
Okay, so the training one first. Our goal, the goal with the AI system that we're developing is that it's completely graphical user interface. So just buttons that you push with a reporting template that comes up. So, kind of like a dashboard style thing. That should be very accessible to a non-technical user. I trained some people in Zanzibar who are managing a local MPA there in a couple of hours, basically showing them the software for setting it up, how to put one in the water, and the software for analyzing the data. So if you just go as far as a spectrogram, you can look for boats visually in a spectrogram. You can use freely available software that's open source. It would take an hour or two to show someone how to do it.
Wow.
It's not all that complicated. The only challenging bit that you need the AI system for is, if you've got a hydrophone in the water for 3 months, that's 3 months of continuous sound data. So if you look at that spectrogram by spectrogram, it's going to take you a long time. And so that's the reason to automate it. But it should be readily available for non-technical users. And really what you get out of the whole process in the end is number of boats, number of hours of boat engine, distance away, location, things like that. So that's all information that should be quite familiar to a fisheries manager. It's measures of effort and location and activity and things like that. It'd be the similar stuff that they get out of their logbook or their VMS system.
Thank you. That's really good to know. And I know, lastly, let's jump to really interesting, Chris. Very much would like to keep track of the upcoming deployments. Has there been any discussion with federal agencies on integrating this data into situational awareness systems? Sorry, we've got 2 minutes. I hope we don't all get cut off on the hour because I don't know what Zoom will do to us. But yeah, let's.
Given the person said federal, I'm assuming they're from the US. So there's some work in NOAA on working on them for monitoring vessel speeds in go slow zones and things like that. I don't think that it's very tightly integrated, say, into NOAA Office of Law Enforcement processes. Probably the biggest barrier at the moment is getting the data off in real time, as you would for a VMS, is a challenge. Sound data is big, and you have to transmit it from a surface presence somehow, or have them cabled from the shore. And so that was my comment about real-time information. It's probably not as valuable as the intelligence analysis you would get in terms of the amount of effort is required. So as far as I know, there's no active integration of hydrophones into things like NIMS enforcement at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you.
There is some efforts in Australia I do know of where they are doing MPA enforcement. So MPAs are a little bit different in that context.
Maybe they can pick up with you separately
Sure.
after this. That was fantastic. I think we've got all of we've got all the questions done. I'd like to say for anyone who hasn't asked a question and does have a question, please do reach out to Chris. You can do so through Fish Tech Connect, and you may have seen, you'll have the recording as well tomorrow to see. Thank you, Chris has just shared his details. So once again, huge thank you for everyone attending today, and big thank you, Chris, for your presentation, which was fantastic. I hope you come back and that you will share later this year your work with WildAid, and love to hear more about the real-time units. Just a quick note, everyone, look out for our next workshops and webinars that are coming in. If you would like to present, then get in touch with me. But yeah, that was fabulous, and have a great day. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Inga. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Good evening. Bye-bye.